Iran. So I just got back from Iran. We had a group of 28 people. It was a fantastic trip, very hard to get the visas. You know, you can go to Iran as a tourist. You're allowed from our government to go to Iran, and the Iranians allow you to go. There aren't a lot of groups that go. But we went in a little more difficult way because we went as more of a people-to-people educational kind of thing. And so it was harder to get the Iranians to give us the visas. They really carefully checked who was going and everything. But finally, when we got the visas, we did the trip. The first day of our trip, we had a hour-and-a-half long meeting with the foreign minister, which was quite remarkable, not only because it was such a great meeting, but also because it turned out the next day he resigned. Did you hear that? You heard about the foreign minister? He resigned, but the president did not accept his resignation, and so many people in their parliament, as well as in the society in general, came back and said, no, no, you can't resign, we need you here, that he came back in. But he talked to us for an hour and a half about U.S. betrayal after betrayal after betrayal. And he said, you know, we are an ancient civilization, you are a brand new one. We go back thousands of years. In fact, he said we count in millennium. It seems like yesterday to us that the U.S. did a coup to overthrow our democratically elected government in 1953. That was like yesterday. And it is on the minds of everybody in Iran. They will not forget when the U.S., because that government in Iran wanted to nationalize the oil, the U.S. went in and engineered a coup. And then they say, since then, there have been so many other betrayals. And one of them became clear to us a couple of days later when we went to visit something called the Peace Museum. And it's run by people who had been involved in and suffered from the Iran-Iraq War that happened between 1980 and 1988 when Saddam Hussein invaded Iran. It was not Iran's fault. Saddam Hussein invaded Iran. And what did the U.S. do? Sided with Saddam Hussein, sold them weapons, and gave them the materials to produce chemical weapons. And these men who showed us around the Peace Museum were the victims of that. One had both his legs blown off. One had a hacking cough the whole time that he led us around. And one had tears that kept coming out of his eyes from the chemical weapons. This is since the 1980s. And they said, we remember the United States supporting Saddam Hussein during that time. We also talked to the foreign minister about his long, tedious negotiations for the Iran nuclear agreement. Negotiations that he said had been going on for over a decade, and then intensely under the Obama administration. And he talked about how they fought over every paragraph, every sentence, every word in that document. And to think that Donald Trump is going to get something else, he said, is ridiculous. That was negotiated with the entire world community, approved by the entire world community. And Donald Trump unilaterally pulls out. And what the foreign minister basically said to us is that this is destroying his reputation with the people. Because when the U.S. pulled out, it imposed these very, very harsh sanctions that are destroying people's lives. 80 million people in Iran are suffering the collective punishment of Donald Trump deciding that he didn't like the Iran nuclear deal. Why? Because Israel and Saudi Arabia didn't like the Iran nuclear deal. So 80 million people have to suffer from that. And this is called extraterritorial sanctions, where it's not just U.S. companies that are not allowed to trade. It is all companies around the world. If you want to do any business with the United States or do any business in dollars, which is over 90% of world trade, you cannot trade with Iran. And they were boasting in that hearing today how they had sanctioned over 1,000 individuals and entities for having violated the U.S. illegal pulling out of an agreement that was ratified by the United Nations. So the ones who were obeying the agreement are getting punished for it, and the Iranian people are getting punished for it. And we heard person after person telling us things like, oh, food and medicine is supposed to be exempt, but medicines are drying up because the pharmaceutical companies are afraid to send things, the banks are afraid to process, the shipping companies are afraid to ship, and the insurance companies are afraid to insure. And aside from that, people don't have money anymore, so they don't have the money to buy the stuff. And so there are all kinds of shortages now happening. And when Brian Hook, do you know him? He is the special envoy of Donald Trump for Iran, but really against Iran. He spoke to AIPAC, and he got tremendous applause when he said, Iran is suffering its worst economic crisis in its 40-year history, and the people at AIPAC thought that was just fantastic. And I think, how sad, how sick, how horrible, how anti-people can you be to blame the Iranian people, 80 million people, because you don't like their government? And really, this whole mantra that they always say that Iran is the #1 source of terrorism in the world is just BS. You want to tell me the #1 source of terrorism in the world? Okay, so some of you say Israel, some of you say the US, and some would say Saudi Arabia. So I think all of them would be good contenders for the #1 spot. But it really is not Iran. So there is just a drumbeat for war with Iran right now, and it's getting harsher and harsher. And in fact, those of us who are peacemakers, when some of you might know Colonel Ann Wright, who is a wonderful peacemaker, well, 26 of our people got back into the U.S. with no problem. Ann Wright and I come bringing up the rear, and lo and behold, not only do we get stopped at customs for, quote, secondary search, where they insist they can take and did take our electronics to take anything off of it and everything off of it that they want, and if we refused, they would be confiscated. But after that, then they told us, there are some gentlemen waiting for you over there who would like to speak to you. Anybody have a guess of who they were? The FBI. The FBI wanted to talk to us about the scary thing of a peace delegation going to Iran. And let me tell you, the Iranian people, I think, are the nicest people in the world. They're the most hospitable, the most wonderful. Everyone in our delegation, when they were approached by somebody, it would be kisses and hugs, and can you come to my house for dinner, and next time you have to stay with me, and we love Americans. But to the FBI, it was just a very, terrible thing that we had gone as a peace delegation to Iran. So there are some things that we can do about Iran. The other issue we heard from Iranians is about the Muslim ban, because they're part of that Muslim ban, even though there has never been one Iranian who has been involved in any kind of terrorist activity in the United States. And time after time they would say, I can't go see my daughter, I can't study in the United States. The vice mayor of Tehran met with us, and he said, I got my PhD from the United States, and I wanted to have my son study in the United States. And he's a very party line guy. He's not a super, certainly not a rah-rah U.S., but he thinks the U.S. educational system is really good, and he thinks exposure to the U.S. is good. His son got into Cornell, but because the Muslim ban, was not allowed to go there. And so he said, it just doesn't make sense. If you want Iranians to have a back and forth and learn how great the United States is, why are you keeping us out? And so there are 2 bills in Congress trying to lift the Muslim ban that we can be supporting. And there's also the issue of there will be a piece of legislation soon to say we should rejoin the Iran nuclear agreement, but right now it's really important to get people on record for that, especially the presidential candidates. So we've been working very hard to have them publicly come out and put it on their platforms. And one thing that has been extremely successful that we're very excited about is that it is now in the Democratic Party's own platform to rejoin the Iran nuclear deal. That's a very, very positive thing. And in fact, the foreign minister knew about it and said that they were encouraged by it, and basically said that the fate of Iran is in the hands of the people of the United States. If you don't get that guy out of the White House, Iran is in big trouble and the whole world is in big trouble. And they said, and so we've managed to get, Bernie Sanders says, yes, rejoin the Iran nuclear deal. So does Elizabeth Warren. So does Tulsi Gabbard. And one person we haven't gotten, and it should be a no-brainer, is Kristen Gillibrand, because she voted for it. So we have been contacting her, and we would encourage, if there's a call that you can make tomorrow to her office, to say, please come out publicly and put it in your presidential platform that you support rejoining the Iran nuclear agreement.
Hi.
Hey.
I want to thank you for the presentation. I was just thinking about two things that just came into my mind. I was thinking about a few things that came into my mind that maybe we should consider and talk about. One is the relationship between the immigration crisis and climate change, particularly in Central America, particularly in Honduras. And I was down in Tijuana, and I think you could see that very clearly. That's number one. And two, I wanted to talk about, just make a statement about what I think is quite important with the Green New Deal. And that is to talk about a transition and to talk about how jobs will be created, and that when we talk to people, we need to really, really emphasize that this is going to lead to losing of jobs in certain sectors, but really the gain of jobs in many other sectors. And for working class people, it's extremely important that we talk this way. That's just comments.
Yeah, thank you. Both important points. In terms of migration, it's true of Central America, where there have been also this cycle of droughts and floods, and it's also true of the violence in Central America, so the combination of wars and climate chaos. And of course, we see that throughout Northern Africa and in the Middle East, and when you see the mass migration to Europe, a lot of that was caused by climate chaos. And think of just what's going to come in the future when folks are talking about heat of 120, 130 degrees in some places where people are not going to be able to live, where they're going to have to flee. And we already see how Europe has been really in tremendous upheaval with the rise of the right, in part because of this migration. So it is a huge issue, and thanks for making that connection as well. And then the other thing you said was about the transition in jobs, and I don't know if any of you have seen, it's a great study that's been updated that the University of Massachusetts did, showing how many more jobs that you could get through anything from education to healthcare, and particularly for green jobs, than the money that's invested in the military. So every time they say, we can't close down this factory because it's jobs, we have to say, transition, transition, transition. Yes.
Hi, thank you for being here and for being you. And what I want to ask you to please talk to us about is something that's, I find sometimes controversial in the peace movement. And that is when you're talking about coalition building and getting out on the street, let's say about Venezuela. And there's an organization that's called for a demonstration, and other organizations don't agree with everything that one has to say. Do you or does Code Pink have principles about when you decide to co-sponsor, or what it is that you do decide to do? And I just think it would be very helpful to us to hear your opinion on that.
Yeah, I know it's a tough issue. We really feel that it's important to make coalition with groups that we might not agree with totally, but they're out on the streets doing something about it. And in this case, when you look around and see who organized against the U.S. intervention in Venezuela, it was pretty much the Answer Coalition. They got people to D.C., they got people out in demonstrations in Los Angeles. When we said the embassy is under attack, come on down, they got people to come. And so I think especially now when there is such a danger of things like military intervention in Venezuela, and there are so few groups. You know, when a number of us were younger, there was a large coalition around Latin American solidarity. Many of us went to Central America, made friends, learned the language, became part of a solidarity movement here. There were sanctuary churches all over the United States. There is not that same kind of movement. There's the support around immigration issues, but it doesn't extend to the broader issues around things like Venezuela. So I say we should applaud people who are getting out on the streets and saying no to intervention, and we should be on the streets with them.
Hi. So we all know that the U.S. government has frozen the money from Citgo and Venezuela's money in U.S. banks illegally. Can we get a list of those banks and start targeting those banks through our own direct action? So can we bypass, in a sense, this begging Congress for things only, and let's start hitting Citibank if that's who it is. Do you know which the banks are? We could boycott those banks. We could demand that they unfreeze the money that's desperately needed in Venezuela.
That's a fabulous idea. I didn't think of that, and I can find out what banks there are, and if you leave me a note, we'll follow up about that. I think it is a great idea, because we always have to look for targets that are not just Congress and not just standing outside the White House. So yes, I think it's a great thing to do, and you know it's billions of dollars that they have frozen, and it really is money that the Venezuelan government would spend a lot of it on medicines that are scarce right now.
So let's put a committee together from this very meeting, not put it off, and those who want to work on it, see us afterwards, and we'll put a committee together to work on that.
Fantastic. Maybe we could just set put a separate sheet on the table back there, on the Code Pink table, and people could sign up if they want to be part of that. It's great.
Hi, Medea. Thanks for being with us tonight. Always great to listen to you. My question has to do with, I guess, the Green New Deal. And if you could go into a little bit more detail in terms of your sense as to how quickly we can see forces for peace joining with the climate change movement, and is the Green New Deal the key? Thank you.
I think it's one of the keys, and that we should be looking for those opportunities wherever they are. A number of people have been involved in the Poor People's Campaign, and as part of the Poor People's Campaign, it took the Martin Luther King trilogy of racism, poverty, and militarism, and added environmental issues into that. And so every time there was a major gathering around the Poor People's Campaign, it brought all of these issues together, and still continues to do that. The Poor People's Campaign is strong in some cities and states and not so strong in others, but it's another good vehicle to use. The Green New Deal, you know, we have, we and the group World Beyond War have proposed language to try to get added into the Green New Deal that talks about this relationship of war and environment, and also talks about the Pentagon funds as a place to get money from. And we're in sort of slow talks with people about that, but it would be nice to up the pressure on that and have it be really very clear in their materials. We, as Code Pink, always go out to any major environmental demonstrations with our War is Not Green banners, and we try to make sure that it's in the points that the demonstration points of unity come about. So I think, wherever there are opportunities, but certainly the Green New Deal is where there's a lot of momentum right now, so that should be a place that we are there in solidarity as part of, and I think we should all consider ourselves environmentalists as well, but try to insert these issues in.
I assume that some of us, or maybe many of us here, are against the Indian point and against nuclear energy for this country. And it is not a big stretch for us to also wish the same for Iran. And in your travel, I assume, or I hope, that you met with people who are against the idea of nuclear energy for Iran. If a country that is relatively resource-rich like Iran pretends to have the need for nuclear energy, what hope is there for many poor countries like India, which United States or Russia or China can't mess with? What hope is there? I mean, we have to think in long terms, long-term energy solution terms. And here's a quote from Gore Vidal. He used to say that this country got prosperous thanks to unspoiled land, lots of timber, slave energy, and cheap energy. And we have a hard time contracting. The same problem exists for all other countries, including China, India, and Iran. Iran did not have 80 million people 40 years ago. What did they think? How did they think that they could maintain a life standard for increasing population? I'm from Turkey. I can say the same thing about Turkey. Turkey doesn't even have oil.
Yeah, and good points that you're making. One of the reasons we supported the Iran nuclear deal is because it would stop Iran from getting a nuclear weapon if indeed that's where they were going. We certainly want to see an end to nuclear weapons and phasing out of nuclear energy as well. It was very funny in Iran because we worked very hard to get the itinerary that we wanted, but there were a couple of things on the itinerary that they said you must go to, and they forced us to go to, and one of them was a nuclear reactor. And it was so funny because people in our group had been like you protesting nuclear energy for so many years, and we said we don't want to go to a nuclear reactor, and they forced us to go. And their point was to say we are using this for educational purposes and for medicines and for peaceful purposes. And we maintain this same position that we want to see a phasing out of all nuclear energy, and they said, it's one thing to be selective about what countries can do what, but internationally, by international law, we have the right to nuclear energy. And by international law, why is it that Iran is singled out around its nuclear program when nobody talks about Israel? And they talk a lot about Israel and Iran, of saying it has hundreds of nuclear weapons, and nobody ever says anything about it. U.S. government doesn't even admit it and doesn't do anything to force Israel to join the Non-Proliferation Treaty or allow any inspectors into Israel. And they point to countries right by them, which is India and Pakistan, and say they never joined the Non-Proliferation Treaty. Their weapons are totally illegal, and yet nobody is threatening them. So it's this selective kind of we will target Iran. And another really bad thing is happening, which is young people who are against nuclear weapons in Iran are now rallying in favor of leaving the deal and saying, hey, we did the deal and then the U.S. violated it. Let's pull out of the deal and let's get a nuclear weapon, because that seems like the only way that we will have some respect. Look at North Korea. And it's a horrible thing for them to conclude, but you could certainly understand why they would go in that direction. And it was in the hearings today with Pompeo that one of the Congress people brought out that there were secret agreements that the U.S. has been providing technology for nuclear material to Saudi Arabia. And the Congress wants to know what those secret agreements are. And I thought it was kind of clever the way one of the guys, the congressman said it, is if we can't trust them with a bone saw, are we really going to trust them with nuclear material?
We're here in the meeting house of the Society of Friends, which is a religious organization, but it's just one religious organization. I'm wondering if you have any thoughts about activating churches, more of them, acting more in unison. It seemed that that was very important during the Vietnam War, but now we're in an era of perpetual war, which in a way almost makes Vietnam pale by comparison. And also, since I'm last in line, maybe I can ask you another, which is you mentioned a number of positions that you'd hope that presidential candidates would be taking and the ability to pressure them between each other. And there are so many wars, so many of those issues, and so many presidential candidates. Is there some kind of visual grid up somewhere right now where we can look and see where everyone stands on those issues?
So Rusty mentioned that I just did an article on that, and we're trying to put that into a graphic as well, but you can find the article on several websites like Common Dreams and Alternet and Truthdig and Truth Out. A number of them have put it up, but it does go candidate by candidate on a number of those issues. And then in terms of the churches, you know, the Poor People's Campaign is faith-based and has a lot of churches that are involved in it, particularly in the South. And there are quite a number of churches that are involved around the immigration issues. But around these issues of the wars, it's precisely the fact that there are so many different ones. And I would say about Yemen, there has been a very good interfaith group that has been working on this, of Presbyterians, of Methodists, Jewish groups, Muslim groups. So that is one area where I think we can see it as an example. And our hope is that once this finally passes both the Senate and the House in the same form, and goes up to the president's desk, that this will be seen as an example both of using the War Powers Act, and we can use it in other situations, and also an example of this broad-based coalition that I mentioned, you know, left and right, but it really has quite a strong interfaith component to it as well.
Is there anyone else out there who has not spoken? We'd love to hear some diverse points of view, particularly of demographics who haven't felt welcome to get up and speak. So can I encourage anyone who has any other questions or last questions for Ms. Benjamin if you're not able to come up on the mic, we can try to bring it to you. I'd just like to mention one thing. Some of you may have heard that 3 Mile Island, the remaining plant, is closing, which I think is a great thing. And I had a question. Is there a tally of the cost of the war in Iraq and Afghanistan? And imagine what we could do with that money.
Yes, there's a very good group called the National Priorities Project, and they have not only a cost of the war, they have the trade-offs of what you could get if, and how much each city and each state is spending on the wars and what you could use that money for. So I encourage you to go to National Priorities Project to look at that. There's also great work that has been done by Brown University, the Watson Institute there, that looks at the cost of the war in its totality, including health care for veterans for years to come, payment on the debt because of the war, all of those things combined.